Log Bait. If there is one deck that has truly left its fingerprints all over Clash Royale's history, it is Log Bait. This archetype has been around since the earliest days of the game and has consistently been one of the most iconic strategies. The idea is simple, but deadly effective. You stack your deck with multiple cards that all demand the same counter, specifically the log. Cards like Goblin Barrel Princess and Goblin Gang are the core of the strategy. Each of them can chip away at your opponent's towers if unanswered, but together they form a frustrating cycle of pressure that punishes every mistake. The real genius of Log Bait is in the way it forces decisions. Opponents often only carry one reliable small spell to handle swarms or barrels. If they waste it on one card, you immediately punish them with another. For years, this has created mind games at every level of play, from ladder to world championships. Do you use your log on the princess at the bridge, or do you save it for the barrel that you know is coming next? That constant tension is why this deck has survived so many balance changes. What makes Log Bait stand out is not just its strategy, but its impact on the meta. People even argued about buffing or nerfing spells like Log or Arrows just because of how strong Log Bait felt. At its peak, Log Bait was one of the most popular decks because it was cheap, easy to cycle, and brutally effective if the opponent slipped even once. Even when it wasn't the strongest, it stayed relevant in almost every meta. Players would rage about Goblin Barrel chipping them down slowly while they felt helpless to respond. Over time, variations of the deck have appeared to keep it alive. Sometimes players ran Rocket as a heavy finisher, other times they swapped in different swarm units to adapt to the current meta. No matter the tweaks, Log Bait has always retained its identity as a test of patience, prediction, and pressure. It is not just a deck, it is a Clash Royale institution, and whether you love it or hate it, you cannot deny its place as one of the most overpowered and influential decks in history. Hog Rider 2.6. When people talk about Clash Royale decks that define skill and frustration at the same time, Hog Rider 2.6 always comes up. This deck has been around for years, and it never really disappeared because of how consistent it is. The core is simple: Hog Rider, Ice Golem Cannon, Musketeer, and cheap cycle cards like Skeletons, Ice Spirit, and Fireball. At first glance, it looks easy to play, but anyone who has gone against a skilled 2.6 player knows how suffocating it can feel. The strength of 2.6 lies in its speed. Because it is such a low-cost cycle deck, you can drop Hog Rider after Hog Rider and force your opponent to always be ready with the defense. If they slip even once, the Hog connects with the tower, and before you know it, your tower is chipped down to nothing. Combine that with Ice Golem kiting troops, Musketeer cleaning up from behind, and Cannon always being ready to defend, and it feels like you are fighting against a machine that never runs out of answers. What made 2.6 overpowered in its prime was how flexible it was. It did not matter if you were facing a beatdown deck, a control deck, or even another cycle. Deck 2.6 had tools to deal with everything. Fireball plus Log gave it reliable spell damage, and the cheap Skeletons and Ice Spirit meant it could constantly reset pushes without ever falling behind on Elixir. A lot of pros made their names with this deck because if you were good with it, you could beat almost anything. Of course, there was always controversy around it. Some players swore it was the purest skill deck in Clash Royale, while others said it was unfair because of how relentless the pressure was. On ladder, facing a 2.6 player often felt like running in circles, never able to build a push before the Hog was back in your lane again. Even when balance changes came and went, this deck refused to die. It adapted, it survived, and it continued to be a staple in competitive play. Hog Rider 2.6 is more than just a deck, it is a symbol of Clash Royale's history. Whether you admire it as a test of skill or hate it for its non-stop pressure, there is no denying it stands as one of the most overpowered and enduring decks the game has ever seen. Miner Poison. If there is one deck that perfectly shows how frustrating, slow, but steady damage can be, it is Miner Poison. This control deck has been around since the early years of Clash Royale, and for a long time, it shaped the competitive scene. The concept sounds simple. Send a miner onto the opponent's tower and drop poison over it to clear defending troops while also chipping away at the tower. Do that over and over again, and suddenly you win, not through one massive push, but by suffocating your opponent little by little. The thing that made Miner Poison feel overpowered was its safety. It was almost impossible to punish because the miner could appear anywhere. You never really knew where it would pop up, and if you guessed wrong, your tower took hits. Add poison on top, and your defending troops were erased before they even had a chance to fight back. For many players, it felt unfair, like you were losing without ever getting the chance to actually play offense. What made the deck especially deadly in pro play was its ability to control control tempo. You were always the one deciding when to attack and when to defend, which made it super annoying to face. Since the win condition cost only 3 elixir, it left plenty of room for cheap defensive units. You could defend against giant Golems, hog riders, you name it, and then instantly switch to offense by sending in another minor poison. The deck did not rely on one big moment, it relied on constant precision, which is why it was so consistent. Of course not. Everyone hated it. Some players saw minor poison as the ultimate skill deck because you had to predict where your opponent would place defenses and carefully time poisons for maximum value. But if you were on the receiving end, it felt like torture. Watching your tower melt over the course of 3 minutes while your pushes were stopped again and again could be one of the most frustrating experiences in Clash Royale. Minor Poison might not look as flashy as other decks, but that is exactly why it was so powerful. It did not need a crazy combo or a huge elixir lead, it just needed patience and perfect timing. Minor Poison appeared at the top of multiple competitive metas, always frustrating players with its safe chip strategy. Even today, its legacy reminds players that sometimes the most overpowered decks are the ones that do not let you breathe. Golem Knight Witch. When players talk about the scariest pushes in Clash Royale history, the Golem Knight Witch combo almost always comes up. For a long stretch, this pairing completely ruled the meta, and many people argued it was one of the most broken things the game had ever seen. The idea was straightforward: drop a Golem in the back and let the Night Witch walk behind it. By the time the Golem reached the bridge, the Night Witch would have spawned a swarm of bats that covered the sky. Suddenly, you were staring at a massive stone tank and a small army of air troops that shredded anything you tried to defend with. What made this deck feel unfair was how hard it was to stop without overcommitting. If you focused on the Golem, the bats would overwhelm you. If you targeted the Night Witch, the Golem would casually punch through your tower. Poison was one of the only consistent answers, but even then a smart Golem player could outcycle your spells or stack more troops behind the push. The synergy was so strong that at one point it felt like every other deck on ladder and in tournaments revolved around this exact combo. Another thing that gave this deck its overpowered reputation was its snowball effect. If your first defense failed even slightly, the Golem explosion combined with surviving bats often guaranteed tower damage. Once the opponent lost one tower, defending the second became nearly impossible because Golem Night Witch thrived in double elixir. Matches often felt hopeless by the halfway mark, which is not a fun experience for anyone on the other side. Of course, from the perspective of players who mastered it, the deck was a dream. It rewarded patience and timing. You could defend lightly in single elixir, then unleash unstoppable pushes once double elixir started. For casual players, the sight of a full Golem Night Witch push was thrilling. It was the kind of big dramatic battle that made Clash Royale feel like an epic strategy game rather than just a card cycle simulator. Supercell eventually had to step in with balance changes, nerfing the Night Witch's bat spawn rate and tweaking the Golem. But even with those adjustments, the deck remained playable for years, which speaks volumes about just how strong the original version was. Golem Night Witch was not just powerful, it defined an era of Clash Royale where one combo forced everyone else to adapt or lose. Elite Barbarians. Rage. Few things in Clash Royale history have felt as brutally unfair as the Elite Barbarians Rage combo. The idea was simple, but devastating. Drop Elite Barbarians at the bridge and rage them up. Suddenly, 2 of the fastest, hardest-hitting ground units in the game were sprinting toward your tower at lightning speed. If you did not have the perfect response in hand, you could watch your tower disappear in seconds. Many players called this strategy skillless, and, to be fair, it often was. The raw stats of Elite Barbarians combined with Rage created a push that punished even the smallest mistake. The power of this deck came from forcing panic. When you saw Elite Barbarians charging, your first instinct was to throw down any troop available, but in Rage, those Barbarians tore through defenses before they had time to scale. Even tanky cards like Knight or Valkyrie melted under their blades. Swarms like Skeleton Army or Goblin Gang sometimes worked, but only if you placed them after the rage dropped. A single missed timing meant a disaster. Players on the receiving end described it as one of the most frustrating experiences in Clash Royale. What made this strategy even worse was its accessibility. Unlike legendary or high-skill decks, this one was cheap to build and easy to use. New players loved it because they could win games without much strategy. All they had to do was cycle to Rage and drop Elite Barbarians. For a long time, the ladder was filled with these decks, making the experience miserable for anyone trying to climb. Tournament players mocked it for being low skill, but they could not deny how effective it was in the right circumstances. Another reason this deck earned its overpowered reputation was its snowball potential. If the first push connected, you often lost a tower outright. With the enemy ahead in crown advantage, they could repeat the same cycle while you scrambled to defend with fewer resources. Matches often ended in 2 minutes or less because the combo was so unforgiving. Rage amplified the already strong stats of elite barbarians to the point where balance felt non-existent. Supercell eventually adjusted both cards, nerfing elite barbarian speed and tuning rage, so it was less overwhelming. But the memory of that period still lingers. For many players, elite barbarians' rage represents the height of Clash Royale frustration. It was not elegant, it was not clever, but it was undeniably one of the most overpowered strategies the game has ever seen. Lava Loon. If there was ever a deck that could make you throw your phone across the room, it was Lava Loon. The Lava Hound and Balloon pairing has been terrorizing Clash Royale since the early days, and it is easy to see why. Bindoir. Lava Hound is one of the tankiest air units in the game, and it soaks up damage while slowly drifting toward your tower. The Balloon follows right behind, targeting only buildings and dealing massive damage with every hit. Put them together, and you have one of the most overwhelming win conditions Clash Royale has ever seen. What makes Lava Loon so overpowered is how brutally it punishes unprepared opponents. If you do not have strong air defense, you might as well kiss your tower goodbye. Arrows and zap clear away supporting troops like minions or bats, while the Hound tanks. By the time the balloon drops its first bomb, you are already in panic mode. A single balloon hit can remove nearly half a tower's health, and with clone or fireball added to the mix, the push becomes devastating. Many players felt helpless against it because the deck forces you to always keep air counters ready. Lava Loon also thrived in tournament and competitive settings because of how consistent it was. Top players used it to punish slow cycle decks and punish opponents who overspent on ground defense. Its synergy with spells like Fireball or Lightning made it nearly impossible to stop once the push started. Even if you defended perfectly, the Lava Hound's death spawn of lava pups forced you to spend even more elixir or risk your weakened tower falling. The pressure was relentless, and it often felt like you were defending 2 pushes in one. For casual players, Lava Loon became infamous on ladder. It didn't take much skill compared to decks like X-Bus or Miner Control. All you had to do was build a push and watch your opponent scramble. Players without the right counters in their deck had almost no chance. This accessibility combined with its high damage output made it one of the most hated strategies in the game's history. Supercell has made balance tweaks over time, but Lava Loon has never fully disappeared. Its core idea is just too strong to erase. Even today, if you queue into a Lava Loon player and you don't have solid air defense, you are in serious trouble. To me, Lava Loon is the definition of an overpowered deck. It is straightforward, it is brutal, and it has shaped Clash Royale's meta more times than I can count. The Three Musketeers beatdown deck. If there's any deck in Clash Royale's history that deserves to be called broken beyond reason, it's the Three Musketeers beatdown deck from their early days. When the Three Musketeers card was released, it felt like Supercell had introduced a cheat code into the game. The card itself was already terrifying. For 9 elixir, you could drop 3 powerful ranged units that each packed the damage output of a mini tank. But what truly broke the game was how players built decks around them. The most infamous version was a heavy beatdown build that combined Elixir Collector, Battle Ram, Minion Horde, Ice Golem, and sometimes even the heal spell when it existed in its original form. The idea was simple, but devastating. You'd use Elixir Collector to build up insane advantages, and the moment you had a big Elixir lead, you'd split the 3 Musketeers in the back. 2 would go one lane, and the third would go down the other. Suddenly, your opponent was forced to defend both sides at once, each with massive threats barreling toward their towers. Now, here's where it gets really unfair. If the enemy tried to counter with spells like Fireball or Poison, they could only deal with one side, leaving the other lane wide open for destruction. And if they didn't have their spell in cycle, well, good luck, because there's almost nothing in the game that could cleanly stop 3 of the most powerful ranged attackers pushing down both lanes simultaneously. Add in a battle ram charging alongside or a minion horde flying over, and defenses would just crumble. Subjectively, probably one of the most annoying metas Clash Royale has ever had. Not only was it powerful, but it was also incredibly frustrating to play against. Matches often came down to whether or not you had the right spell rotation at the right moment. If you slipped up even once, you'd watch both of your towers disappear in seconds. It got so bad that Supercell eventually had to nerf the 3 Musketeers repeatedly and even rework other cards just to keep the game balanced. And yet, even years later, people still remember the rage of facing a split Three Musketeers push with full support behind it. To this day, that deck stands as one of the most infamous examples of what happens when elixir management meets unchecked power. Archer Queen deck. Few cards in Clash Royale have ever warped the game as much as the Archer Queen did when she was first released. On paper, she seemed balanced enough. A 5 elixir champion with decent health, a quick attack speed, and an ability that lets her turn invisible while shooting faster. In practice, she was a nightmare that completely reshaped how people built their decks. Players quickly realized that her ability could single-handedly win trades. For just 1 elixir, she disappeared from sight, dodged attacks, and melted through entire pushes before reappearing to keep firing. The craziest part was how well she could fit into almost any deck. In some decks, she acted like a support troop standing behind tanks and deleting enemy defenses. In others, she was a win condition on her own, sneaking across the bridge and locking onto towers while your opponent scrambled to deal with her. There were countless moments where even if you predicted her ability and had the right counter, it still felt impossible to stop her without losing value. Her impact in competitive play cannot be overstated. Top ladder matches and tournaments became dominated by Archer Queen cycle decks, especially Royal Hogs and Miner Control. The ability to cycle her so cheaply while getting massive value turned games into showcases of who could manage their Archer Queen better. At one point, it almost felt like Clash Royale was not about strategy anymore, but about spamming Archer Queen and pressing the ability button at the perfect second. For me, this was one of the most frustrating eras to watch and play in. Normally in Clash Royale, there are trade-offs. A strong tank means you sacrifice speed. A powerful spell means you give up elixir elsewhere. The Archer Queen broke that balance. She gave insane offensive power while also being a defensive lifesaver. She could shut down air pushes, melt tanks, and then immediately turn around and threaten a tower. No other champion or troop had that kind of all-in-one dominance. Supercell eventually had to nerf her ability damage and duration multiple times, but even after those changes, she remained strong. That says everything about how overturned she was at launch. The Archer Queen was not just overpowered, she was meta-defining in a way that forced every player to either run her or build a deck specifically to counter her. To this day, she is remembered as one of the most game-breaking additions Clash Royale has ever seen.